Today, Steve's going to be sharing with us about some life-changing God encounters. Steve.
My RAF career was good. I was in the Air Force for 22 years and I worked up the ranks. I then became a commissioned officer, and again, interesting things there. My ego loved being a commissioned officer. I loved the officer's mess life, and I found that I was very committed to it, to the point where probably I was more committed to it than I should have been. And what I mean by that is I would leave out other things. And slowly and slowly, the partying, the drinking, and my self-will all started to combine into a problem, really. And eventually I found I was married, I'd had 2 kids, and my increasing level of dysfunctionality was getting a problem. The marriage ended, and it was a great big mess. I didn't really understand what had happened, but the wheels had come off, and of course then people around me started saying that I needed to do something different, that I needed some help. And that was where the marriage at that time ended, and I started to look for ways, realising finally that something was awfully wrong. And I contacted some people in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I also moved away from the family home a little while after that as well. I started to go to AA meetings, and then because everything was in a terrible state, I moved away and moved to mid-Wales. We lived in Bristol, but I moved to mid-Wales. What happened there was I had stopped actually drinking alcohol and managed to stay stopped. I was able to find AA meetings, but I was in Landry-in-Dog Wales. If anybody know mid-Wales, it's a pretty remote place. I was there for business because I did have the vision to start a small business that went quite well for many years. So I'd moved there to be next to a business partner. But meetings were at least an hour's drive away, and in the winter that was very, very difficult. And I often used to wake up in my little flat in Landry-in-Dog Wales thinking I feel unsafe, I'm not connected, I'm not doing enough. And for the first time ever, literally, I had a reply from God, which was quite a simple one. It was, you've seen that little church down the road? It was actually on the street, one street down from where I live. You need to go there, and go there this morning. Because funnily enough, this was a Sunday morning. And it was a church very much like the church on the roundabout. And the doors were open, it was a hot day, the band was playing, and I walked in, and people turned around and smiled at me. And that was the start of a very important journey as well, where I found that not only by going to Alcoholics Anonymous and learning about the real risks of alcohol, the fact that for me, I needed to be totally abstinent from alcohol. If I wasn't, then very, very quickly I would decline back down into a self-absorbed sort of crazy guy, basically. There's no other easy way of putting it, but that's what happens to me. And in the church as well, I quite quickly got to know some people who were very outreaching in the local community. They actually ran a little drug and alcohol drop-in on a Friday morning in the church, and that was great. I'd go to that and help them. I lived very close to the pastor and his wife, and as people do, they reached out to me, and I'd go to meetings in the evening or just pop in for coffee, or they come and see me. And I started to learn from those people about love. I also started to learn about putting other people first and about doing service.
So, Steve, can you tell us how you encountered God at this time, and also how things have proceeded from this point?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned just then, that particular day in Landry-in-Dog Wales, where I felt at risk, was one way to put it, lonely, sort of unloved, I guess. And I sort of, as I awoke, I sort of asked that question, what do I do? And I meant it. I mean, it was and I think that's one of the things that I realised for me is I'd ask questions of people before that point, but didn't really mean it. You know, I wasn't going to do what they suggested. That might be a good way of putting it. And the first time I asked a question of God, I mean, we all did religious education at school, and in the military there were always church services, but that was the first time I actually asked a question, I suppose, with the intent of doing what the answer was. And it came quickly, the answer, and it was very clear. And I remember being amazed by that, and I think for a few weeks and months after that, when I started going to that church in Landrin Wells, I would then talk to people in the church about it, say, look, I actually feel like I've actually had something from God, an instruction.
So you're experiencing prayer, really, in that you talked to God and then you heard back.
Yeah, and I think what was amazing was I didn't do a sort of a normal praying process. I just asked the question with an open heart and a genuine intent to do what the answer was going to be, whatever it was going to be.
But definitely a two-way process.
But definitely a two-way process. And later, and then quite quickly after that, there were various other little events or things that happened where I didn't know what to do. And I quite quickly just asked the question, God, what do I do? And again, I remember one day I had to go into something that was a bit risky. There was a group of people that were not in the best of states, and it could have been a bit violent, but I needed to go in and ask a lady in that group a question if she was all right, and I literally stopped and said, am I going to be all right? And God said, I will look after you, I will protect you, go and do what you've got to do. And I walked in and all these people parted, spoke to the lady, turned around and walked out again. I was perfectly fine. And then I stood on the other side of the street sweating, thinking, wow, that was pretty cool, you know. And of course I took that sort of story back to the church, and little knowing nods from everybody else going, yeah, God's talking to you now. And so from that point on, I've always had that communication, and I developed that. Of course, I was doing a lot of AA recovery type stuff as well, 12 steps, which we might talk a bit more about later on. But what that did was it enabled me to connect probably three things really. God, what the people were all about in church, and what AA was all about really. And it's all the same thing. Ultimately, AA, for all its books and all its techniques and processes, it very clearly comes back, and Bill W., the founder of AA, was always incredibly clear about that, because he had the same thing. He had the same contact from God when he was in a dire situation, and he said, one day I asked the question, I got an answer back, and I knew I had to do it. So I think that sort of rock bottom for alcoholics or perhaps drug addicts, from my experience certainly, is that finding God point. And once that happens and you realise how dangerous your own self-will is, and certainly in terms of an addiction, the self-will will always just keep fueling the addiction. As soon as you can let go of that and say, you know, thy will be done, then you've got a chance. And for people, most people I've ever met in recovery and church will all say the same thing. It's when you find that point.
Steve, it's great to hear about your connection with God, but we've also talked about the 12-step program. How does all this fit together?
Okay, yes, that's a good question, Tony, because I think for me it took a while to start to understand the depths of the 12 steps, really. Where I left off in the last question, this for me, the real contact with God. What I started to understand then when I was going to AA meetings is how Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, had been very clear that whilst we're in a state of addiction, alcoholism or anything else, we're run by our self-will. And that self-will runs riot, does damage in everything we try and do. And so he created the steps. The first few steps are basically about admitting that we're powerless over alcohol and that our lives are unmanageable. And all the steps in the middle are about how we identify all the things that we do wrong with our self-will and our thinking. And I won't go into any detail about that because it does get quite complicated. But what's very interesting is that Bill W ends up bringing the steps back to God, because step 11, if anybody wanted to look it up, step 11 is about developing a conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation. But what's so important there is that it comes after the main mending steps, the main steps that stop us doing what we're doing wrong. And I found that so important that later on my contact with God in the early days was, if you like, a little bit panicky, a little bit fear-driven, a little bit lack of understanding. Well, actually quite a lot of lack of understanding. The steps enabled me to free things up. It enabled me to not be panicking, worrying, overreacting, living in fear, letting my ego run away. And I practiced and practiced and practiced that in the steps, as everybody does who does the 12 steps, for a few years. Then when you get to step 11, and the first few times you look at it, you probably don't completely get it. But it brings us back round to now having understood and having a process and getting away from that crazy alcoholic head. I now can push that away and I now replace it with the conscious contact with God. And then step 12 is about how you then deal with carrying the message. About what's so important with that is then telling other people about your experiences and how, if it's helped me, hopefully it would help someone else.
So you've talked about the importance of carrying the message to others. And you've really taken that to the next level by writing a book.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I haven't gone over the steps in any depth, but as you say, step 12 is about, once we're in recovery, about how we carry the message to other people. Now, one of the things in my past that I mentioned earlier on was the damage that I'd done to my first family, my first wife and 2 children, and they're grown up now and things are pretty good between us. But I'd done an awful lot of damage in my drinking days and in my early recovery. And as I looked in depth at the sort of my behaviour, and I was also going to AA, I was doing things like going away to conventions and lots of meetings and meeting lots of other people, and I found a common theme, which is a lot of addicts destroy relationships, and that, you know, this was a sorry tale for a lot of people. And I started to feel a real calling as from God. This was sort of almost less AA and more God again, back from God, saying to me, Steve, write some of this stuff down. What you've learned about relationships and how addiction does so much damage, and how working with my will, i.e. the will of God, is a solution. And I think a lot of us would probably relate to experiences where, you know, we can do great work in our jobs, we can do great work in church, but sometimes a personal relationship can be really tough. And so I just had a calling from God to write it down, and that's what I did. And so that's how I wrote the book.
That sounds a really amazing book, Steve. If people want to look at a copy, where can they get hold of it?
The book is available on Amazon, and if anybody, you can search for it with my name and the title of the book, which is Relationships in Recovery. But if anybody can't find it, then if they wanted to find it, let me know and I'll send them a link.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.